The whip was already in his hand when she hit the dirt. Drace Hollis had her by the wrist, dragging her down the middle of Coldwater Forks the way a man might drag a stubborn calf. And Della Wren's boots cut 2 long furrows in the frozen ruts as she fought him every foot of the way. The shoulder seam of her dust-gray dress had torn through, and the cold wind off the river found the bare skin there and made her flinch, but she did not cry out, and that, more than anything, seemed to anger the man hauling her. He gave a last wrench and let go all at once, and she went forward onto her knees in the middle of the street, palms skidding in the dirt, the breath knocked half out of her. Up and down the boardwalks, the town of Coldwater Forks stood frozen in the raking morning light. There were 30, maybe 40 of them out that cold autumn morning. The storekeeper in his apron, 2 cowhands with spurs still on, women with baskets on their arms, and children pressed to their skirts, the barkeep leaning in the saloon doorway with a rag in his hand. And not one of them moved. Not one of them spoke. They watch the way people watch a thing they are ashamed to be watching and cannot make themselves stop, their eyes sliding away and creeping back. Drace Hollis uncoiled the bullwhip from his belt with a flick of his wrist, and the long black length of it dropped and lay in the dust like something alive. Della pushed herself up to her knees. One side of her auburn hair had come down out of its pins and hung in a heavy coil against her neck, and there was already a dark bruise rising high on her left cheekbone from earlier, from the back of someone's hand, and her lower lip had split and swollen. She lifted her chin and looked not at Hollis, but past him, up the saloon steps, to the man who had sent him. Augustus Marsh stood at the top of the steps of his own saloon with one polished boot resting on the lower rail. A heavy-set man gone thick through the middle in an expensive charcoal coat. A gold watch chain looped across the strain of his waistcoat, a silver-headed cane held loose in one fat hand. He was not even looking at her with anger. That was the worst of it. He looked at her the way a man looks at a sum that has come out wrong, a small irritation, a thing to be corrected. His thin mouth wore the permanent, contemptuous half-smile of a man who has not been told no in 20 years and does not intend to start being told it now by a widow on her knees in his street. "Mrs. Wren," he said, and his voice carried easily in the cold, still air, pitched to be heard by every soul on that boardwalk, because he wanted them to hear, wanted them to learn. "I have been more than patient with you. I have been generous. I came to you as a neighbor with money in my hand, and you spat on it." He came down one step, unhurried, the cane tapping. "A reasonable woman in your circumstance, alone, no man to advise her, would have thanked God somebody was willing to take that worthless rock and water claim off her hands at all, and signed where she was told to sign. But you are not a reasonable woman. You have made me come down into the street in front of the whole town to teach you what stubbornness costs." Della spat the dirt from her mouth. "It cost my husband his life," she said. "I expect it'll cost me mine. But you'll not get it cheap, and you'll not get it quiet, and these people are going to remember every minute of it." A ripple went through the watching crowd at that. A small shift, a few eyes dropping to their own boots. Marsh's half-smile did not change, but something tightened around his small, pale eyes. The land she would not sell was called Wren's Bend, a fold of bottom ground 2 hours south, where a year-round spring fed a creek that ran sweet and cold even in the worst of the dry, the only living water for 30 miles in any direction, in a country where water was the only thing that mattered at all. Her husband Tom had filed the claim 3 years gone and married her 2 years after that. Then the talk had started about the railroad pushing a spur up the valley, and a man's grazing land was suddenly worth a fortune if he had the water to make it run cattle, and Marsh had the land but not the water, and Tom Wren had the water and would not sell it at any price. 3 months ago they had found Tom at the bottom of a dry draw with his horse fallen on him, and the men who looked at it had called it an accident, a careless rider on bad ground, and Della had stood at the graveside and known in her bones that it was a lie. Since then Marsh had squeezed her the way a careful man drowns something he doesn't want to look at. Her 2 hired hands run off, her credit closed, the bank silent, and every legal road quietly walked shut ahead of her. This morning he had sent Drace Hollis out to the bend with 2 riders to take the signed deed by force, and when she would not sign it, Hollis had put her across a saddle and brought her into town to do it where everyone could see. "The deed, Mrs. Wren," Marsh said. "You have it on you. Hollis tells me you do. Sign it over, here, witnessed, and you can climb on a coach and go back east to whatever you came from with your skin whole. Or—" He lifted the cane a few inches and let it fall, a small gesture toward the man in the black duster, and Drace Hollis, who had been waiting for it, gathered the coiled length of the whip up off the ground in a slow, practiced sweep that made his meaning plain. "It's all he left me," Della said. Her voice shook now, but she made the words come out anyway, looking up at Marsh, at all of them. "And it's not just mine. There's a dozen poor families south of the bend that water their stock and their gardens off that creek, and the day you have my deed, you'll dam it and cut every one of them off, and they'll be gone inside a year. You know it. That's the point of it. So no, I won't sign. Not to you. Not ever." Drace Hollis grinned, the cold, flat grin of a man who has been told he may do the thing he likes best. He stepped back to give himself the room, and his weather-burned hatchet face under the black flat-brimmed hat showed nothing but a kind of patient pleasure, and his right arm cocked back, and the long whip uncurled behind him and hung at the top of its height for one held heartbeat over the kneeling woman with her chin still raised and her eyes shut now, and her torn shoulder bared to the cold. And across the street, in the open doorway of the livery stable, the new hired man set down his pitchfork. He had been there the whole time, though no one had marked him, because there was nothing to mark. Just another drab working man in a faded indigo shirt and scuffed brown vest, a sweat-stained slouch hat pulled low, his sleeves rolled to forearms scarred and sun-darkened, his boots crusted with the muck of the stalls. He had come to Coldwater Forks a week before and asked the liveryman for work and been given it, and he had spent that week being exactly nothing, a quiet man who forked hay and said little and was already half forgotten by the people who passed him every day. And where every other man on that street had flinched at the violence or looked away, the stable hand had not moved at all. He stood very still in the doorway, with the cold light on the lower half of his sober face, and his pale gray eyes did not jump from thing to thing the way frightened eyes do. They went to Marsh on the steps and read him and dismissed him, and then they settled on Drace Hollis and stayed there, flat and unhurried, tracking the whip hand and nothing else, the way a man watches the one thing in a room that can hurt him. There was a stillness in him that did not belong to a man who mucked stalls for his bread, and the only sign of anything underneath it was the way his weight had come up onto the balls of his feet. Then the whip reached the top of its arc, and the stable hand stepped off the boardwalk into the street. He crossed it faster than seemed possible for a man moving so calmly. There was no run in it, no shout. He simply was on the far side of the street, and then, by some economy of motion the watching townsfolk could not afterward describe, he was there, between Drace Hollis and the kneeling woman, his back to her and his face to the whip, so that when the long black length of it came down, it had nowhere to go but into empty air, and Hollis, off balance, checked the stroke at the last instant and let it die in the dust at the stranger's feet. "That's enough," the stable hand said. He did not raise his voice. He said it the way another man might mention that it had clouded over, a plain statement of a settled fact, and in the frozen silence of the street it carried farther than a shout. Drace Hollis stared at him. For a moment, the enforcer seemed unable to fit the thing in front of him into the morning he had planned. This drab, dusty nobody, this manure-booted livery hand, standing in the open with empty hands and a whip stroke dying at his feet and looking at him without the first flicker of fear. Then Hollis laughed, a short, ugly sound, and recovered the whip with a twitch of his wrist, gathering its length back up into a loose coil. "Walk away, stable boy," he said. "This here is town business and none of yours. Go on back to your hay before you find out what that smell on you really is." Up on the steps, Marsh had come down another step, frowning now, the half-smile thinned. The stable hand did not walk away. He stood easy in the middle of the street with his hat low and his hands loose at his sides, and his pale gray eyes never left Drace Hollis's face. And when he spoke again, it was just as quiet and just as certain. "She's done answering you," he said, "and you're done with the whip. Coil it and tell your man on the steps the lady's got nothing more to say this morning. Then everybody walks off in their own direction, and nobody gets a thing on his conscience he has to carry home." "On his conscience," Hollis repeated, and laughed again, but there was a thread in the laugh that had not been there a moment before, because the dusty man was not behaving the way dusty men behaved. "Mister, I have whipped bigger men than you off this street for less than standing in my way. You're about to make the worst morning's work of your life." He let the coil drop again, slow, deliberate, daring the stranger to watch it fall and lose his nerve. The stranger watched it fall and did not lose anything at all. And then Hollis drew his arm back the second time, faster now, meaning it, and the whip leapt out toward the kneeling woman behind the stable hand. And the stable hand stepped into the arc of it. He stepped in, not back, inside the reach of the lash, where it could do nothing but wrap harmless around his forearm, and his scarred hand closed on the leather and held it, and for a long moment the two men stood joined by the taut black line, and Drace Hollis pulled, and it did not give, and the stranger's pale eyes looked at him over it, flat and patient and without fear, and said, very low so that only Hollis could hear it, "Don't." Something passed across Drace Hollis's hatchet face than that he could not have named and did not understand. It was not fear, not yet. It was the cold prickle of a thing half remembered, a face seen somewhere long ago in worse company, the unease of a man who has put his hand on a stove that ought to be cold and felt it warm. His eyes moved over the stranger's sober face, the faint pale scar nicking the left eyebrow, the flat gray eyes that never seemed to blink first, and for a half-second longer than was natural. His stare hung there, hunting, and the color in his weather-burned cheeks went a shade lighter. Then he shook it off the way a man shakes off a chill, because the thought was absurd, because this was a stable hand smelling of horse, and he wrenched the whip free of the stranger's grip and stepped back, coiling it, and turned half toward the steps for Marsh's word. Marsh gave it. He was no fool, whatever else he was. He had counted the heads on the boardwalk, 40 mouths that would carry the tale, and weighed what it would cost to have his man flog a stranger to the ground in a crowded street on a clear morning, and found the price too high for the sake of one saddle tramp he could break at his leisure later. "Leave it, Hollis," he said, the contempt back in place over the irritation. "Leave it. I don't pay you to brawl with the hired help in front of the whole county." He came down the last steps onto the boardwalk and looked at the stable hand the way a man looks at a stray dog that has gotten underfoot, a thing too small to kick. "And you, friend, whoever you are, you've bought yourself into something this morning that you do not understand and cannot afford. A week's wages forking hay won't cover what your manners are going to cost you, but not today. Today I have business." He turned his attention to Della, who had gotten herself up onto one knee and then to her feet behind the stranger, swaying, one hand pressed to the bruise on her cheek. "Mrs. Wren, the offer stands until the end of the month. After that, I take the bend the legal way, and you take nothing, and no stable hand in the territory will be standing in the street to catch what falls on you then. Think hard on your friends south of the creek." He set his black hat on his head and turned and went back up the steps into the saloon, and Drace Hollis backed away after him with the coiled whip in his hand and his eyes still on the stranger, that half-knowing unease still working behind them, until the saloon's bat-wing doors swallowed them both. On the boardwalks, the breath came back into the crowd. There was a low murmur, a shuffling, the small, embarrassed motion of people remembering they have legs, but still none of them came forward. They only looked now at the dusty man standing in the middle of the street, and the looking had changed. The stable hand paid them no mind at all. He turned, and the hard set went out of him as he turned, the dangerous quality folding itself back down into the drab small shape of a hired man. And when he faced Della Wren, he was only a tired worker with kind, careful hands and a sober face. "You can stand?" he asked her, low, just for her. She nodded, though she was not at all sure of it, and put her hand out and caught his forearm, and he let her steady herself on him, and did not take hold of her, did not touch her more than that, only held still and solid as a fence post until her feet were under her. Up the boardwalk, a stooped old man in a dark coat and small round spectacles was already hurrying, a battered leather bag swinging from one hand. Doc Abernathy, the town's one doctor and one of the few souls in Coldwater Forks who had ever shown Della Wren a kindness. He took her bruised face in his gentle old hands and turned it to the light, clucking, his watery blue eyes going hard with anger behind the spectacles in a way that anger never reached his hands. "Della, oh child, the cheek's not broken, but it'll color up something fierce, and that lip. Come to my rooms and let me clean it." He shot a glance up at the stranger, a quick measuring look, grateful and curious all at once. "That was a brave fool thing you did, mister, and I thank God somebody did it, but Augustus Marsh does not forget. You've made an enemy this morning that owns the bank, the store, the law such as it is, and half the paper in this town." "I know what he owns," the stable hand said, and there was no heat in it, just that flat certainty. He looked at Della while the doc worked, and he waited until she had stopped trembling enough to hear him, and then he said the thing he had crossed the street to be able to say. "You're not staying in this town tonight, Mrs. Wren. You go back to that shack at the bend alone and he'll send men out after dark, and there'll be no street full of witnesses to make him careful. You can't stop here in town either. Every roof in it owes him money." She pulled back from the doc's hands and looked at the stranger properly for the first time, and her wide hazel-green eyes, red-rimmed and frightened, took him in slow and full of distrust, because the last thing left to a woman with nothing is the right to be wary of the next man offering to save her. "And who are you," she said, "to tell me where I'll sleep? I don't know your name. I never saw you before this week. Maybe you're his too, sent out to play the gallant and walk me somewhere quiet." "Maybe I am," he said, and there was the ghost of something almost like a smile at the corner of his mouth, gone as soon as it came. "You've no good reason to trust me, and I won't insult you by giving you a poor one. But you've a worse reason to trust the man who put that bruise on your face, and that's the only choice in front of you this morning. I've got a place out in the foothills, 2 hours south, a line shack, a fire, a roof, a door that locks. You'll have the bed, and I'll have the floor, and a rifle, and in the morning, daylight, your own choice, you ride wherever you please and owe me nothing. That's the whole of the offer. It's a poor one. It beats the alternative." Doc Abernathy looked from one of them to the other, and then put a hand on Della's arm. "He's right, child. God help me," the old man said quietly. "There's nothing for you in this town but Marsh's men after dark. I'd take you to my own rooms, but they'd come for you there, and I haven't a thing to stop them, and you know it. At least out of the country there's distance and a locked door. Go, let me put a salve on that lip first, and then go, and send me word you're whole." Della Wren stood in the middle of the cold street with the whole town watching, and waited. She looked at the saloon doors that had swallowed the man who killed her husband, and at the rutted street where she had knelt in the dirt while 40 people watched and did nothing, and at the stranger who had crossed that street faster than seemed possible and talked the whip down without ever raising his hand or his voice, and who now stood waiting on her word with no more urgency than if he'd offered her a cup of water. She did not trust him, but she was done that morning, being made small in front of people who would not lift a finger, and the foothills were at least a direction that was not this one. "All right," she said. "All right, 2 hours, and I'll have the doc's kitchen knife in my apron the whole way, mister, and I'll use it if I've cause." "I'd think less of you if you didn't," the stable hand said, and that was all. He let Doc Abernathy take her into his rooms to clean the split lip and salve the cheek and pin the torn shoulder of her dress closed, and while she was in there, he went back to the livery and saddled 2 horses without hurry, paid the liveryman a week's owed wages, and rolled his few things into a blanket behind the cantle and into one saddlebag. He set, carefully, a long bundle wrapped close in oilcloth that he did not open and that no one saw him handle. When Della came out into the late morning light, her face cleaned and her dress pinned and the borrowed knife heavy in her apron, he was waiting with the horses, holding the head of the gentler one for her, and he gave her a leg up without a word and swung on to the other, and they turned south down the long, single street of Coldwater Forks with the cold wind at their backs and the whole town watching them go. No one called out. No one wished them well. The boardwalks emptied slowly behind them as they rode, the people drifting back into their stores and their houses with the shame of the morning still on them, and at the edge of the street, where a weathered board on 2 posts read, "Coldwater Forks, Wyoming Terroir." In faded paint, Della Wren looked back once over her shoulder. Augustus Marsh had come out onto the saloon steps again to watch them leave, both hands folded over the silver head of his cane, that contemptuous half-smile fixed on his florid face. And he was not angry and not worried, and that was the thing that turned the coal deeper in her than the wind ever could. He watched them go like a man watching a debt ride away that he knew would come back to him in full, at his own time, on his own terms. Della faced front and rode. The foothills rose ahead of them, brown and snow-streaked under a thin gray sky, and the town fell away behind, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all. The only sound the horses' hooves and the creak of leather and the wind. Then, because she could not help it, because a person has to know something about the man she is riding into the empty country with, she spoke. "You never told me your name," she said. The stable hand rode easy in the saddle, his hat low, his pale eyes moving over the country ahead, the way they had moved over the street, reading the ground, the rises, the places a rider might come from, out of some habit she did not understand, and he did not explain. "Cobb," he said, "Eli Cobb, I muck stables." And he said it so plainly, so finally, that there was nothing for her to do but believe it. This tired, drab man who mucked stables and had, that morning, walked into the reach of a bullwhip without a flicker and faced down Augustus Marsh's enforcer with 3 quiet words and no gun at all. Whatever the cruel of this world had coming to them, she thought, watching him, it had not come yet. But if you've ever stood on a boardwalk and watched and done nothing, if you've ever wanted to see the men who drag widows through the dirt finally meet a thing they cannot buy or break, stay a while, because this is the morning the reckoning began. 2 riders going south out of a guilty town with the whole long debt still ahead of them. The town of Coldwater Forks closed up behind them, and Augustus Marsh, on the saloon steps, watched until the 2 small shapes had dwindled into the foothills and were gone, and then he turned and went inside to begin, in his patient and contemptuous way, to plan exactly what it would cost them. As they passed beneath the sign, Della walked stiff and small at his side, one arm wrapped over her ribs, and every few steps she glanced sideways at him, as if to catch the moment he turned into whatever he really was. He said the shack was 2 hours out, that she would be cold before they got there, and that she could ride if she wanted. He would walk. She had spent 3 months learning that every kindness in this country came with a price written somewhere in small letters, and she was waiting for the price. When she did speak, her voice came out flat and hard. She asked him what he wanted. He stopped the horse and looked at her in the failing light, the bruise dark on her cheekbone, the way she held herself like something that had already decided to break before it would bend. And whatever he saw made the line of his mouth go quieter still. He said he wanted her to get up on the horse so she didn't freeze. That was all. Then he laced his fingers into a stirrup of his hands and waited, patient as a fence post, until she understood he meant it, and she let him lift her up, careful not to touch her more than the lift required. He shrugged out of his worn brown work coat and held it up to her. She did not take it, so he laid it across the saddle where she could reach it or not, and turned and started walking, and after 100 yards in the rising cold, she drew the coat around her shoulders and hated herself a little for needing it. The town fell away, and there was only the wind and the creak of leather, and Della found that out here the fear sat differently in her, not gone, but changed, a slower thing. She watched the back of his head, the way he moved without ever seeming to hurry, and yet covered ground faster than a walking man should. She had seen those eyes track Drace's whip hand the way a cat tracks a bird, and she had seen Drace Hollis, who had put the fear of God into half the men in 3 counties, find something in this drab man's face that made him let the whip fall slack. She only knew that decent men did not look like that, and that the ones who did usually wanted something worse than land. So she rode behind him in the dark and did not let herself be warm. They came down at last into a fold of the foothills where a creek ran black and quick between bare cottonwoods. And there in the lee of a low ridge stood the shack, a squat thing of log and sod with a stone chimney and 1 shuttered window, a pole corral beside it, and a lean-to barn behind. It was a poor place and a careful one. He had chosen it, she would understand later, for the way the ground rose at its back so nothing could come at it from above, for the long open approach a rider had to cross in plain sight, and for the single trail in. He helped her down. He opened the door, which had no lock but a heavy bar, and went in ahead of her and knelt at the cold hearth, and in a few minutes had a fire going from banked coals and kindling laid ready, and the one room bloomed into warm amber light. She stood in the doorway and looked at it, a rope bed with a folded wool blanket, a rough plank table and 2 stools, a few tin plates, a coffee pot, and over the door, on 2 pegs, a rifle, clean, oiled, ready. She marked it the way she marked everything now, by how fast a person could reach it. He saw her mark it and did not pretend he hadn't. He took the rifle down and set it on the far wall, away from the door, away from her path to it, and stepped back, and the meaning of that small rearrangement was not lost on her. He pointed at the bed and said she'd take it. He'd have the floor by the fire. She asked where the price was in that. He said there wasn't one, and put the coffee pot on, and she sat down on the very edge of the bed with her back to the wall and the torn shoulder of her dress hanging, and watched him make coffee in a stranger's shack in the middle of outlaw country, and she did not lie down, and she did not sleep. The long night went by in the orange flicker. He gave her the first cup and took none until she had drunk. She noticed that too, and turned it over for the trick in it, and found none. She found a paring knife on the table when he stepped out to the horses, and palmed it, and slid it up her sleeve. And he came back in, and his pale eyes went to her sleeve, and then to her face, and he said nothing at all about it. And the very fact that he let her keep the knife, let her sit there armed against him in his own house, and never once made her feel the foolishness of it, did more to ease the wire-tight thing in her chest than any soft word could have. Still she tested him. It was the only way she knew to find the bottom of a man. She started low and got sharper. She said she knew his kind, that a woman alone was a thing men out here divided up like land, that he could drop the patient act because she'd seen what was under patient acts before. She said worse than that, things meant to draw the snap out of him. She pushed until her own voice shook, and he sat on the floor with his back against the cold stones, the firelight on the wind-creased planes of his face, and let her say all of it. And when she ran out, he said only that she was right to be careful, that he wouldn't ask her to stop, and that she could sleep, or not, as she liked. But she was safe in this room whether she believed it or not. There was no heat in it. There was no plea in it. It was a plain statement of fact from a man who did not seem to need her to agree. And somewhere in the hour past midnight, against everything 3 months had taught her, the first thin crack ran through the wall she'd built, and she felt it go, and she was angry at it. And she lay down at last on top of the blanket with her boots on, and the paring knife in her fist, and watched him until her eyes would not stay open. And the last thing she saw was the line of his back between her and the door. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and gray light at the shutter, the knife still in her hand, and he was crouched at the fire, turning meat in a pan. And for one disoriented breath, she did not know where she was, and then she knew, and the knowing did not bring the dread she expected. He'd hung a strip of canvas across one corner so she could wash in private, with a basin and a clean square of cloth folded beside it. Small considerations a careless man would never think to make. Over the meal she found herself telling him. Not because he asked nothing, but because 2 years of it had been sitting in her chest like a stone, and there was finally a person who did not flinch, and did not pity, and did not look away. She told him she'd come west on a notice in a Missouri paper, a man wanting a wife, the kind of arrangement that went wrong 9 times in 10, and that hers had gone right. Tom Wren. A plain, decent, hard-working man who'd filed the claim at the Bend before she ever came, the only year-round Sweetwater in 30 miles, and who'd met her off the stage with his hat in his hands and never once in 2 years raised his voice to her. They'd been poor and happy, and the water kept not just their own place alive, but a dozen others. A widow named Hetty Pratt with 3 children, an old freedman called Moses, who'd homesteaded a quarter nobody else wanted, a sick family down on the flat, all of them drawing on the Bend because Tom said water wasn't a thing a man ought to own all of. And then Marsh wanted it. The railroad was coming, a spur down the valley to ship his cattle, and dry land along a rail line was worth little but watered land a fortune, and the Bend was the key to all of it. Marsh offered to buy. Tom said no. Marsh pressed and sent his lawyer and then sent Drace to talk, and Tom still said no. And 3 months ago they'd found Tom at the bottom of a draw with his horse on top of him, and the man Marsh kept in the sheriff's office had ridden out and called it an accident. A horse spooked and gone down a cut bank, and they'd buried Tom on the rise above the creek where he could see the water. Della's voice did not break when she said she had never believed it. Tom had ridden that ground 1,000 times and could read a horse the way other men read a page. But there was no proof and no law to take it to, and a widow's grief was not evidence, and so she had done the only thing left to her, which was to refuse to sell, to hold the deed her husband had died over, because it was all he'd left her, and because the water kept a dozen poor families breathing. And Marsh had set about teaching her the cost of that. He'd run off her hired hands, called in a banknote that wasn't due, put the word out at the store that her credit was no good, cutting her off from the town a little at a time, the way you'd starve out a thing you couldn't shoot, until she was hauling her own water and going to bed with the doors barred, fighting alone and losing. And then he'd run out of patience and sent Drace to take the signed deed out of her hands in front of the whole town as a lesson to anyone who thought of telling Augustus Marsh no. She told it in the flat, steady voice of someone who has gone over a wound so many times it has stopped bleeding, and Eli Cobb listened without once interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet a long while, and then said, in that same low, certain register, that she'd been carrying a man's worth of fight alone, and that it didn't make her weak that she was losing. It made her about the bravest person he'd met in a long time. And he said it like a thing he simply knew, not a thing he hoped would please her. And Della Wren looked down at the thin gold band gone loose on her work-reddened hand and did not trust herself to answer. 2 hours' ride to the south, the morning broke very differently over Coldwater Forks. In the long, dim room of the Marsh Saloon, with the back bar mirror cracked across one corner and the oil lamp still burning against the gray dawn at the windows, Augustus Marsh sat at his table by the stove with a plate of eggs and a cut of beefsteak, and the contented ease of a man who has never in his life been hungry or afraid. And he listened to Drace Hollis tell it, and his florid jowled face went slowly from amusement to something colder. He did not like that the story had a hole in it shaped like a stranger. Marsh owned this town the way other men owned a watch. He owned the bank that held the paper on half the homesteads in the valley, the general store that sold them their flour, the man who wore the sheriff's star and did the sheriff's nothing, the saloon they drank their wages in, and a good share of the wages besides. He had spent 15 years patiently making the place his, and he was not a stupid man, and not, by his own lights, even a cruel one. He simply could not conceive of a world in which a thing he wanted was not eventually his, and he experienced the people who stood between him and his wanting the way a man experiences weather, an inconvenience to be waited out or driven off. The railroad survey had come through in the spring. The spur would make every acre Marsh held worth 10 times its dry land price, but only if the cattle had water in the dry months, and the only year-round water for 30 miles came up at Wren's Bend, and a dead man's stubborn widow was sitting on it with a folded paper. It was, to Marsh, not a question of right. It was arithmetic. The water was wasted on a clutch of dirt-poor squatters who'd be gone in a hard winter anyway. In his hands it would build a town, with his name on the bank and the depot. He told Drace as much, between bites. And then he came back around to the hole in the story, and his small, pale blue eyes went mean. A stable hand, he said. A saddle tramp who'd mucked his stalls a week and chose yesterday of all days to grow a conscience in front of the whole town. He didn't like it, not because he feared one drifter. Marsh had buried better men than drifters under accidents, but because the town had seen it. The town had watched a nobody do the thing none of them dared, and a town that watches one man stand up gets ideas, and ideas were the one crop Marsh could not afford to let grow in Coldwater Forks. He set down his fork. He told Drace to find out who the man was, where he drifted in from, what name he gave, whether there was paper on him anywhere, because saddle tramps with nerve like that usually had a reason to keep moving, and to find out quietly and quickly. And he told Drace to make the widow's position impossible, not another public circus, something with the cold weight of law behind it that no stranger could step in front of. Post the eviction. Cut the squatters off the bend by force so they'd turn on her for the trouble she'd brought down on them. And put it about, where she would hear it, that Della Wren had until the last day of the month to sign over the deed and ride out, or be put off the bend legally and for good, and that anyone fool enough to help her would find their own paper called and their own credit gone. Drace listened with his hatchet face still and his cold, flat eyes on the cracked mirror. And he said it would be done. And on his way out, he stopped a half-second at the door with a frown he couldn't account for, the same frown that had crossed him in the street the moment the stranger stepped inside the whip's arc and was not afraid. A name on the tip of the tongue, a face he'd seen somewhere on a piece of paper a long way back. And then he shrugged it off and went out into the cold to set Marsh's screws turning, and the deadline was a real thing now, ticking. Out at the shack, the day went on quiet, and Eli Cobb was at his smallness like a craftsman. Della watched him through the morning, the deliberate, practiced way he made himself nothing. the faded shirt and the manure-stained boots, all of it not the poverty it looked like, but a kind of careful costume, worn the way an actor wears a part so long it becomes a second skin. He moved with his hat low and his shoulders rounded, smaller than his frame, and she realized he had spent a week in that town being looked through. Being the kind of man whose face slides off the memory, and that he had done it on purpose. She did not understand why a man would work so hard to be no one. But she began to notice the seams in it. She watched his hands at the work, and they were a stable hands in their scars, but not in how they moved. Too sure, too economical, no wasted motion anywhere. The hands of a man whose living had once depended on being faster and surer than another man's. When he came back into the shack, he stood a moment in the doorway before entering, and his pale eyes tracked the long open approach and the rise at the shack's back and the trail in. A reading of the ground done so automatically she did not think he knew he did it. And in the lean-to, when he'd thought she was asleep, she had seen him take from his saddlebag a long bundle wrapped in oilcloth, heavier than its size, and weigh it in his hands a moment and not unwrap it, only set it back, deep, and lace the bag shut over it. And she had lain very still and said nothing, because a woman who had survived what she'd survived knew there were questions you did not ask of a man until you were sure of the answer you wanted. That afternoon, she finally let one of them out, sideways. He had taken her chin gently in 2 fingers to look at the bruise, pressing the swollen place with a touch so careful it barely was one, and said the bone was sound, just bruised deep. And while he did it, she looked up close at the hand at her jaw and said, lo, that his hands were wrong. He went still. She said a stable hand's hands were rope-scarred and split across the knuckles from the fork and the shovel. And his were scarred, but not those scars, and there was a flat, hard ridge of callus along one finger that came from no fork she'd ever seen, and that he handled everything like a man who knew exactly how much force broke things. She said it plainly and watched his eyes. And something moved far back in them, a shadow under deep water, there and gone. And then the calm came down over it like a hand smoothing a cloth, and he let go of her chin and said only that a man picked up scars in a long life of work, and that hers was the face that needed tending, not his hands, and the door was closed on it as gently and finally as a man closing a book he is not going to read aloud. She let it lie, but she had seen the shadow, and she knew now there was a different man inside the small one, a man kept folded away like the bundle in the oilcloth. And the strange thing, the thing she turned over by the fire that night and could not make come out frightening, was that the knowing did not scare her. It steadied her. Whatever he was, it stood between her and cold water forks. He cooked for her that evening, and afterward, without making any matter of it, he took up the torn shoulder of her gray calico dress where the seam had been ripped in the street, threaded a needle from a little tin he kept, and sat by the firelight and sewed it closed with small, even stitches, his big, sure hands moving the needle as delicately as a woman's. She sat across the fire in the clean blouse he'd found her from somewhere, and watched him mend the dress that Drace Hollis had torn off her shoulder in front of the whole town. And she did not know why her throat went tight, except that no one had done a careful thing for her in a long time. And the man doing it was a man other men were plainly afraid of. And there was something in the contrast of those two facts. The dangerous stillness in him and the small kindness in his hands. that undid a knot in her she had not known was tied. He finished the seam and bit the thread and shook the dress out and looked it over and handed it across to her without a word, and their eyes met over the fire and held a beat longer than they had to. And then she took the dress, and he looked back to the flames, and neither of them said anything at all, and the slow first ember of a thing too early to name caught and held in the warm dark of the shack. It was just at that early dusk, the second day, the light going to cold blue over the ridge and the fire throwing the only warmth, that the dogs of the place that were not there to bark were replaced by the only warning the shack had, which was Eli himself going suddenly still in the middle of reaching for the coffee pot, his head lifting, his whole body changing in an instant from the rounded smallness to something straight and listening. Della heard it a moment later, hoofbeats, more than one horse, coming up the long open trail in the failing light, unhurried, the slow, deliberate walk of men who want to be seen coming. Eli set the coffee pot down without a sound. He looked at her, and his voice when it came was even and low and left no room in it for argument. Stay inside, stay back from the window, and whatever she heard, do not come out that door. She started to say something, and he was already gone, out into the yard, easy and slow, his hands empty and loose at his sides, and the rifle left where it hung on the far wall behind her. And she understood that he was going out to meet armed men with nothing in his hands on purpose, the way he'd crossed the street with a pitchfork left in the dirt. And she went to the gap in the shutter with the paring knife forgotten in her fist and watched. 3 riders came down into the fire-lit edge of the yard and reined up. She knew the lead one before she could see his face, by the black duster and the flat black hat with its silver band and the coiled whip at his belt, and the way he sat a horse like a man who'd never once in his life been the one afraid. Drace Hollis. The 2 behind him were saloon muscle, dull-faced men with rifles laid across their saddle bows, there to make a number. Drace looked at the small, drab figure standing easy in the yard with empty hands, and he smiled his thin, cruel smile and said he'd come a long way to deliver a message, and that the stable tramp could save himself a deal of grief by stepping aside and letting the men inside talk to the widow. And Eli Cobb stood there in the blue dusk, unhurried, his hat low and his shoulders easy, and said in a voice that did not rise that there'd be no talking to anybody inside tonight, that they could leave the message with him. Drace's smile thinned. He said the message was for the Wren woman. Marsh's word, plain, the last day of the month. Sign the deed and ride out, or be put off the bend by the law and never set foot on it again. And he added, with the relish of a man who enjoys the cruel detail, that she ought to know the bend was being shut to the squatters as of now. That Hetty Pratt and her 3 and the old freedman Moses and the sick family on the flat would be hauling water off a dry creek by week's end, and could thank the stubborn widow for it when their stock died, and that maybe she'd find a conscience faster than she'd found one before, knowing children would go thirsty for her paper. Della, at the shutter, felt that land in her like a blow worse than the whip had been. And Eli Cobb stood in the yard and took it all in without a flicker, and when Drace was done, Eli said only, mildly, that the message was delivered and that they could go. Drace did not go. He nudged his horse a step forward into the firelight and looked down at the stable hand and said, the trouble with saddle tramps was that they didn't know the size of the thing they'd stepped into. And his hand drifted toward the coiled whip, slow, the way a man reaches for a familiar tool. And Eli did not step back, and did not reach for anything, and did not raise his voice, and something in the absolute unhurried stillness of him, the way he simply stood there in easy range of three-armed men and was not afraid, made Drace's hand stop short of the whip. They looked at each other across the firelit yard, the enforcer and the stable hand, and for the second time that frown crossed Drace Hollis's hatchet face, the half-memory rising, the name on the tip of the tongue, the face from a piece of paper a long way back, and he could not catch it, and it troubled him, and the trouble made him angry, and the anger made him cautious in a way he could not have explained, because some animal part of him had read what the front of his mind would not, and that part was telling him to keep his hands where they were, and his horse pointed home. He covered it with a sneer. He said the widow had until the end of the month, and that next time it would not be him doing the asking. He wheeled his horse hard, and the two dull men wheeled theirs, and the three of them rode back up the long open trail into the dark the way they'd come, and the hoofbeats faded, and the cold came back into the yard, and Eli Cobb stood there a long moment looking after them, straight and still, before the smallness came back over him, and he turned and walked to the shack. Della was standing in the open door when he reached it, the paring knife slack in her hand, and she had heard all of it, and her face was wet, though she did not remember starting to cry, and she looked at him in the last blue light, and she was not thinking now of the price of kindnesses or the knife up her sleeve. She was thinking that she had watched three armed men ride away from one man with empty hands, and that they had not gone because he begged or bargained, but because something in him made them afraid. And she was thinking of Hetty Pratt's three children hauling water off a dry creek, and she understood two things at once and felt them settle into her like stones into a foundation. The first was that she was safe with this man, truly safe, in a way she had not been since they put Tom in the ground. That the room behind her, with its warm fire and its barred door and the quiet, dangerous man standing in it, was the one place in the world the thing that hunted her could not simply walk in and take her. And the second, arriving in the same breath and not canceling the first, but standing beside it, cold and clear, was that being safe with him was not the same as being safe from Marsh, that the men would keep coming, by the law and around it, with whips and with paper, and with worse than either before the month was out, and that no shack in the hills was far enough, because Marsh did not want her gone. He wanted the water, and the water was not going anywhere, and neither, she knew now, was she. She said his name, Cobb, and he stopped on the threshold and looked at her. She asked him, low and steady, what happened at the end of the month when the law came and she wasn't gone. And Eli Cobb looked at the woman in the doorway with the bruise going every color on her face, and the dead man's ring loose on her hand, and the spine in her that 3 months of Augustus Marsh had bent and not broken. And he thought of the message about the children and the dry creek, and he thought of a debt he carried that she did not know about yet, and he thought of all the years he had spent making himself into no one in other men's stables and woodlots, trying to be done with standing in doorways like this one, and he found, a little to his own surprise, that the choice had already been made somewhere below the place where choosing happens. He came in and barred the door behind him and crouched at the fire and built it up against the cold coming down off the ridge, and he said, without looking at her, that nothing happened at the end of the month because he wasn't going to leave her to face it alone. And Della Wren stood in the warm, shifting light of the one safe room in the territory and looked at the back of the dangerous, gentle man who had just told her, as plainly as he'd told her she was brave, that he was hers to stand beside whatever came. And she did not reach for the knife, and she did not wait for the price, and for the first time in 3 months she let herself believe a thing a man had said. The dust of Drace Hollis and his 2 riders had not yet settled on the trail before the cold came down off the foothills in earnest. And Eli Cobb stood a long while in the yard after they were gone, not watching the road, but listening to it, the way a man listens for a thing he expects to come back. And when at last he turned for the shack, Della Wren was standing in the doorway with the lamp behind her and the kitchen knife forgotten in her hand. And she did not ask him whether they were safe, because she had seen his face when he sent them off, and she had seen theirs. And she understood for the first time, fully, that the 2-hour ride out of Coldwater Forks had not bought her distance, only a little time, and that the man who had bought it for her was going to spend whatever else it cost out of his own pocket and tell her none of the price. He took the knife from her hand gently, the way you take a tool from a child who has been holding it too long, and he set it on the table and said only that they should bank the fire and sleep, that nothing more would come up that trail tonight. And she found that she believed him, and the believing was its own strange country, because she had not believed a man's word in 3 months, and had nearly forgotten what it cost a body to set the weight of the night down on someone else's say-so. That first night she slept 4 hours without waking, more than she had slept at one stretch since they put Tom in the ground. And when she woke before dawn, the fire was built up, and Eli was already out at the corral, and she lay under the rough wool and listened to the small sounds of him working in the cold, the knock of a bucket, the stamp of the horses, the rasp of a fork in straw. And the ordinary music of it loosened something behind her breastbone she had been holding clenched for a season. And then she got up and went out to help him, because she had never been able to lie still while there was work, and because she wanted to see if he would let her. He let her. That was the first of the days, and the days made a shape, and the shape was the thing that healed her, more than the salve or the broth or the rifle over the door, or the 2 hours of empty trail between her and the men who'd hurt her. It was the work, the plain shared work of a small place in a hard country going into winter, that put the woman back into Della Wren a piece at a time. They mucked the lean-to and forked down hay and broke the ice off the creek for the horses, and he showed her without seeming to teach her how he wanted the corral poles lashed, and she showed him without seeming to correct him that her own dead father had taught her a better knot, and he tried it and grunted and used it after that. And a man taking a woman's knot over his own without making a show of it did more for her than a week of gentle words. The bruise on her cheekbone went from angry purple to sick green, and then to the faint yellow of an old hurt nearly mended. The split in her lip closed, and she caught herself smiling more than once across the corral at some dry small thing he'd said, each time a little surprised, the way you're surprised to find feeling come back into a hand that's been a long time numb. Her hair, that had hung in the torn ruin of that terrible morning, she washed and combed and braided neat down her back, and she put on the clean cream blouse and brown wool skirt from her bundle, and the day she came out dressed and braided and upright, Eli looked at her across the woodpile a half-second longer than a stable hand had any business doing, and then went back to splitting wood and said nothing, and that half-second was louder than any speech, and neither of them touched it, and that was the slow burn beginning, banked low under the chores. He was not a man who courted. He did not pay her compliments or find reasons to brush her hand. Or rather, he did look, once, that half-second at the woodpile, and having been caught at it, he did not do it carelessly again, and the care itself, the deliberate, gentle, unhurried care of everything he turned his attention to, the horses and the fire and the wound on her face, was the courting, though neither of them would have used the word. She watched his hands in the daylight of the ordinary days and knew she had been right about them. Scarred and sure, never in a hurry, never fumbling, with an economy she had seen in no working man she'd ever known, and that she had seen, now that she thought of it, in exactly one kind of man, a long time ago, before she married Tom, when she was a girl in a rougher town, and a certain sort of quiet stranger would pass through, and the grown men would go careful and low-voiced around him without ever being told to. She did not say any of that out loud. She had learned that he would tell her things in his own time, or not at all, and that pushing him was like pushing a door built to swing only one way. So she watched, and she waited, and she healed, and over the fire in the evenings while the wind worked at the chinking, they talked, and the talking, more than the work even, was where the two of them came together, because a man and a woman alone in a warm room at the edge of winter, with the whole cruel world held off by 2 hours of dark trail, will tell each other things they have told no one, if they are careful, and if they trust, and they were careful, and they came, slowly, to trust. She told him the rest those evenings, the part she'd held back that first wary night. She'd not been born to this hard, high country. She'd come west at 19 on a thin promise, a runaway from a situation back east. She didn't dress up for him, and the promise had soured the way those promises did, and she'd been about as low and alone as a young woman could get in a frontier town when Tom Wren had come into the eating house, where she scrubbed pots and been decent to her, plainly and without an angle, which had so unsettled her that she'd been short with him a month before she understood he meant it. He'd married her and taken her out to the Bend, and they'd built the place up 2 years, and it had been the only stretch of her life she'd ever felt safe. And she said the word safe, and then stopped, because she was sitting in a stranger's shack, feeling safe again, and the irony of it closed her throat. Then Marsh had wanted the water, and the squeezing had started, and then one morning 3 months back, 2 of his riders had brought Tom home across his own saddle, and said his horse had gone down with him at the bottom of the Spencer Draw, a place Tom had ridden 1,000 times on the surest-footed animal in the county. And she had looked at the 2 men and known, the way you know a lie in your own bones, and there had been no law to take it to that Marsh didn't own, and so she'd buried her husband and gone on alone. And Marsh had let her grieve exactly 3 months before he sent Drace to take the deed off her, with a whip in the public street. Eli listened without once telling her he was sorry, which she was grateful for, because the people who'd told her they were sorry had all gone back inside and let it happen. And a man who sat very still and let her say the whole of it was worth more than a town full of condolences. And as the days made their shape, she stopped being, even to herself, only the woman it had been done to. She rode. She'd half forgotten she could, but Eli put her up on the quieter of the 2 saddle horses one bright cold morning to ride the creek line with him, and the country opened her up, the high, clean cold of it, the foothills gold and the sky scoured pale, and by the 3rd day she was riding ahead of him and turning the horse on a dime to show off and not caring that she was showing off. He had an old single shot and a box of shells, and one afternoon he set up bottles on a deadfall, and they shot, and she shot passably, better than passably by the end of the week, and there was a kind of joy in it that surprised them both. The woman who'd been dragged through the dirt 3 weeks gone, now standing braced and breaking bottles in the cold, while a man who said almost nothing watched her with something in his flat gray eyes that was nearly, not quite, a smile. And riding the country, she talked about the people in it, and this was the thing that turned her in those middle days, from a woman saving herself into a woman who could not save only herself. There was the Pruitt widow with the 4 children, whose man had frozen in a line camp, and who watered her garden and her 1 cow off a ditch Tom had let her cut. There was old Moses Teague, a freedman who'd come up the trail after the war and made a hard quarter bloom off the Ben's overflow, and who dug Tom's grave himself and would take no pay for it. And 3 or 4 more, a dozen souls the single Sweet Creek kept alive in a country that would otherwise kill them. And Marsh wanted to fence it and pipe it to his cattle and let those dozen blow away like chaff. And Della, riding the gold cold hills with the feeling coming back into her, understood that she could not take Eli's protection and ride off east and leave Moses Teague and the Pruitt children to dry up so a fat man could get richer. And the understanding hardened in her like ice in a rut, and she stopped, somewhere in those days, being a woman who was running and became a woman who was only resting before she went back. She told him so one evening, plainly. He didn't argue, and he didn't agree. He looked into the fire for a long time, and then he told her his story, or the shape of it, which she understood, even as he gave it to her, was the most he had given anyone in years, and which he gave her, she would understand later, because she'd told him hers, and because of the thing growing between them that neither would name, and because he had decided something. He did not tell it the way she'd told hers, in order, from the beginning. He came at it sideways, in the dark, with the fire low. He said she'd been right about his hands. He said he had not always mucked stables. He said there'd been a long stretch of his life, and he said it flat, without color, the way a man reads off a thing he's made his peace with not being able to change. When he'd been a man that other men were afraid of, when he'd carried his living on his hip and made it with it, on the right side of the law sometimes and the wrong side as often, riding for cattlemen and for shippers and once for a railroad and once or twice for nobody but the highest payer, and that he'd been good at it, better than good. Good in a way he would not describe to her, except to say that being that good at that particular work was the kind of thing that ate a man's life out from the center while he was still walking around inside the husk. He said there'd been a day. He didn't tell her the day. He said there'd been a town and a thing that happened in it that was, in part, his doing, and that there'd been people in it he might have saved and didn't, or couldn't, or was too late, or too slow, or on the wrong side of. He didn't make it clear, and she understood he never would, and that after that day he'd taken the tools of his trade and wrapped them up and gone looking for the smallest, grimiest, most invisible work he could find. Stables and woodlots and other men's hard chores in towns where nobody knew his face, trying, he said, to be no one, to spend down whatever was left of his life being a man nobody looked at twice. She asked him, very quietly, what his name had been. He was a long time answering. He said men had known him by a name in those years that he would not say in this room, not to her, not yet, that it was a name with paper on it, still in 3 territories, with a number on the paper, and that the number had only gone up the longer he stayed buried, because a ghost is worth more than a man. He said she should understand that the man with that name was not a thing she should be near, that the kindest thing he could do for her was send her east in the morning with money and never let her learn it. And Della Wren, who 3 weeks before had been dragged through the dirt of Coldwater Forks and had every reason in the world to be afraid of a hidden gunman with paper on his head, sitting across a dark room from her. Della looked at him across the low fire and was not afraid, not the least particle afraid, and she told him so. And she told him the man she'd watched for 3 weeks was the gentlest, careful man she'd ever known, and that whatever he'd been, she'd put her life in his hands twice already and would do it again tonight, and that she did not believe a man spent 2 years trying to disappear into stable grime out of meanness. And she asked him, because she'd been turning it over, the only question that finally mattered. She asked him why Coldwater Forks. Of all the towns in the West he could have buried himself in, why this one? Why now? Why hers? And he was quiet a long, long time, and the fire ticked, and then he told her the last piece. And it was the piece that changed everything, because he told her he had not stumbled into Coldwater Forks. He had come to it. He had known a man years back, in the bad years, a decent man who'd done him a decency he had no reason to do when Eli had needed one badly and deserved it not at all, a man named Wren, Tom's people. He owed that family a debt of the kind that doesn't get paid off, a debt of conscience, and he'd kept loose track of where the Wrens had got to, the way a man keeps track of the 1 or 2 people in the world he hasn't wronged. And word had reached him down the quiet channels such men still hear things through, that a Wren had filed water in Wyoming territory, and that a Wren had turned up dead under his horse, and that a Wren's widow was being squeezed off her land by a town boss, and he had not been able to ride past it. He'd come, on purpose, weeks ago, and taken the lowest job in the town to watch and learn the ground before he showed his hand, and he'd never meant to be seen. And then he'd stood in the livery door on a cold morning and watched a man raise a whip over a kneeling woman in the public street while a whole town looked away, and the not being seen had ended right there, because some things a man cannot watch and stay buried. And so here they were. Della understood then that nothing about her rescue had been chance, that the quiet, stable hand had not happened to be standing across the street, that he had come 300 miles for a debt to her dead husband's blood and found her on her knees in the dirt, and the understanding went through her like the cold, clean air off the hills, and she did not feel like a thing rescued by accident anymore. She felt chosen, sought, owed, a thing she'd never known was owed, and she reached across the small space between them and took one of his scarred, sure hands in both of hers and held it, and he let her, and neither of them said another word that night, and the fire burned down, and the slow banked thing between them came up at last into a low, steady flame that did not flare and did not need to. There was an artifact in it, a small, cold thing that lay across the warmth like a shadow, and it came the next day. She was folding the saddle blankets he'd had her air, and one of his bundles had worked open in the lean-to. The oilcloth one from the bottom of his saddlebag that she had wondered about and never asked about, and she did not unwrap it. She would not. It was his. But in moving it, her hand turned back a fold of the oilcloth, and there was paper under it, old paper, a folded sheet, gone yellow and soft as cloth at the creases. And she saw, before she made herself stop looking, that it was a handbill, a wanted bill, with a crude inked likeness on it, and a word printed bold across the top, and a reward sum below. And she did not read the word She put the fold of oilcloth back over it, with her heart going hard, and she carried the bundle in and set it by his saddle, and she did not tell him she had seen it, and she did not let herself read the name, because she had decided, somewhere in those fire-lit nights, that she would take him as he gave himself to her, and not 1 inch faster, and that whatever was printed bold on that yellowed paper was his to say to her or never say, and she folded that knowledge down small and put it away, the way she'd put away the knowing about Tom. But she understood it was there, and 40 miles off, while the woman who could have read his name chose not to, other men were trying very hard to read it. Marsh was not a man who took being told no, and he had been told no twice now by a saddle tramp in his own town and out on a trail, and the second telling had reached him through Drace with the dust still on it, and Augustus Marsh stood in the long, dim room of his saloon with the cracked back bar mirror, throwing his florid, jowly face back at him, doubled and contemptuous, and he did a thing he had not done in years, which was lose, briefly, the permanent half-smile, and let the town see him angry. He posted the eviction. He had it nailed to the door of the bank and read out by his bought clerk. The legal seizure of the Wren claim for back taxes nobody had ever assessed before. Effective the last day of the month, 4 days off, and he sent Drace and 3 men down to the bend with axes and wire, and they cut Tom Wren's ditches and fenced the creek and turned the Pruitt widow's children back from the only water their cow had ever drunk. And old Moses Teague stood at his dry ditch head in the cold and watched Marsh's wire go up across the water that had kept his quarter green for 9 years, and said nothing, because there was nothing a freedman could say to 4 armed white men in Wyoming territory that would do anything but get him killed. And the dozen souls below the bend understood that the clock that had been ticking over the widow was now ticking over all of them. And Marsh, having moved on the land, moved on the man, because the saddle tramp had become, in his mind, the one loose thing in an otherwise finished business, and he could not abide a loose thing. He set Drace to it. Find out who the man is. Drace, who'd had a flicker of something the first time he'd faced Eli down in the street, a half-memory that wouldn't surface, went back through what a man like Drace went back through. The talk in the saloons, the faces he'd seen and the faces he'd been shown, and at last, slow and reluctant, a man unwilling to credit a thing that frightened him, he began to go through old paper. The curled and yellowed bills that men in his line kept and traded, the bounty sheets going back 20 years, looking for the lean, still face and the pale, flat eyes, and the faint scar nicking the left brow, and not finding it. Not yet, but looking, getting closer. The dramatic irony tightening like a wire, because the men hunting through old handbills for the identity of the stranger were hunting the one face in all that yellowed paper that should have sent them running for the territory line, and they did not know it, and they kept looking. And Marsh, embarrassed past patience that a stable hand had turned his men twice, and unwilling to be embarrassed a third time, did the thing that would set the last of it in motion. He went to the telegraph office himself, in his fine charcoal coat with his silver-headed cane, and he sent word down the wire, east and south, to a man he'd used once before and sworn he'd never need again, because Drace Hollis with a whip was a tool for frightening widows, and Augustus Marsh had come to understand that the business at Wren's Bend was no longer about frightening a widow. And as the clerk tapped out the message, Marsh stood looking at his doubled reflection in the office window, and the contemptuous half-smile came back. But there was something under it now, just the smallest crack. The anger of a man who has been told no and has decided to stop asking. and the wire carried his money out into the cold, dark country toward a soft-spoken professional who killed for it and was very good. And the threat that had been a whip in the street and 3 riders on a trail became, that hour, a thing of another order entirely, though, out at the shack in the foothills, neither Eli nor Della yet knew its name. The deadline day came the way bad days come in that country, clear and hard and bright. The sky scoured to a thin pale blue, and the foothills sharp with the first real snow. And Eli came in from the corral while the light was still gray and stood by the fire and told her, in the flat, even voice, what he'd already decided in the night, which was that he would take her away. He had it planned. She could hear it. The unhurried completeness of it. Money he had, a route south and east that no one would think to watch, a place she could be, a name she could use, a life out from under all of it, where Marsh's wire and Marsh's men and the yellowed paper in his own saddlebag could none of them reach her. And he laid it out for her as a thing already settled, the kindest gift he knew how to give, the disappearance he'd bought for himself bought now for her. And his last word on it was that he would see her safe wherever she chose to go, and then she would not see him again, because a hunted ghost was no fit thing to tie a young life to, and the safest thing in the world he could do for Della Wren was put her on a road away from him and let her go. And Della Wren stood up from the fire and told him no. She told him she had not come back to herself in 3 weeks of his careful keeping in order to spend the rest of her life running, that she'd run once already, east to west, a girl with nothing fleeing a thing she'd never named to him. And that running had cost her years and a piece of her soul, and she was finished with it. She told him about Moses Teague standing at his dry ditch, and the Pruitt children turned back from the water, and the dozen souls the Bend kept alive, and she said she would not buy her own safety with their thirst, that Tom had died rather than fence that water off from poor people, and she'd be damned before she'd hand it to Marsh to do what Tom died refusing. And then she told him the last of it, the thing that finished the argument, which was that she would not let him do it either, would not let him put her on a road and turn around and go back to being a ghost in some other town's stable, spending down the last of his life invisible and alone for a debt he'd already overpaid twice in her dooryard, because she had watched him for 3 weeks come back to life the same as she had, watched the half-second look at the woodpile and the not-quite smile across the gun smoke, and she knew, even if he would not say it, that the disappearing had not been working on him, any better than the running had worked on her, and that the two of them sending each other off to be safe and alone in 2 different directions was the stupidest, saddest waste of the one good thing either of them had stumbled into in years, and she would not do it. She crossed the room and stood in front of him and put both her hands flat on his chest, over the heart. And she said it square, that she was not afraid of him, and not afraid of his paper, and not afraid of Marsh, that she was afraid of exactly one thing in this world, and it was him riding off, and her never knowing what became of him. And would he please, for once, stop trying to save her by leaving and save her by staying? And Eli Cobb, the most careful man in 3 territories, the man who never wasted a motion or hurried a word, who'd come 300 miles to pay a dead man's debt, and meant to pay it and ride on into the gray. Eli put one of his scarred, sure hands over both of hers where they lay on his chest and looked down at her with the flat gray eyes gone, for once, not flat at all, and he said low that he had not stayed anywhere or for anyone in a very long time, and that he didn't rightly know how anymore. And she said he could learn it the way she'd learned to ride again, a little at a time, starting now, and that was the whole of the love spoken between them. No more than that. Two pairs of scarred hands stacked over one slow heart, and a quiet agreement to stop running in opposite directions. And it was enough. It was more than either had had in years, and it held. They didn't go east. By full light, they had made the other choice, the hard one, together, and there was no more argument in it, only the cold, steady work of getting ready, because a decision like that, in that country, was 9/10 preparation. He saw to the horses and the loads. She packed the small things and banked the fire low to keep the shack against their coming back, if they came back. And when the loads were set and the horses stood saddled and blowing in the cold yard, Eli went into the lean-to alone and came out a moment later with the oilcloth bundle in his two hands, the one she'd never asked about and never unwrapped. The one with the yellowed paper folded under it that she'd seen and chosen not to read. And he did not unwrap it in front of her either. He carried it out and stowed it in his own saddlebag, deep where it rode close. And the act of moving it from the lean-to where it had lain untouched for weeks, to the saddlebag that would ride at his hip into Coldwater Forks, was the last thing either of them said about it. And it said everything, because they both understood that the man who'd buried his trade in stable grime had just dug it up again, on purpose, with the deadline 4 hours gone and a town to ride back into, and that whatever was wrapped in that oilcloth and whatever name was printed bold on the paper folded under it was coming down off the shelf of the past and into the cold, bright present, and there was no putting it back now. She watched him stow it, and she said nothing, and he said nothing, and he handed her up onto the quiet horse and swung up onto the other, and they sat their saddles a moment in the gold, cold morning, with the snow sharp on the foothills behind, and the long trail dropping away toward Coldwater Forks before them. Two people who'd come into this fold of the hills as a rescued stranger and a man trying to be no one, and were riding out of it as something else entirely. Two people who'd chosen each other and chosen the fight. And then Eli Cobb touched his horse with his heel, and Della Wren came up, even with him knee to knee, and the two of them turned down out of the sanctuary toward the town that had watched her dragged through its dirt, riding back not to hide and not to run, but to stand with the oilcloth, bundle riding close in the saddlebag, and the slow burn between them gone now into something settled and unbreakable. And behind them, the shack's thin smoke and the safe warm middle of things fell away into the cold. And ahead of them, though they could not see it yet, the wire Marsh had sent was already pulling a soft-spoken man in a bone-colored slicker up the long roads toward the reckoning T. Hey were all, every one of them, riding to meet. They came back into Coldwater Forks at mid-morning with the sun hard and white off the snow on the foothills. And they came in slow and plain down the middle of the main street, the way two people come who have decided not to hide anymore. Eli rode his bay a half-length ahead and to Della's left, between her and the saloon, the way he always set himself without seeming to, and behind his cantle, lashed under his bedroll, where any man could see it, and no man would think twice, rode the oilcloth bundle he had carried unopened for a week. Della rode the gray her late husband had broke, sitting straight in the borrowed sheepskin coat, her chin up and her bruise gone yellow-green and fading at the edge, and she looked at the boardwalks as she passed them and made the town look back. That was the change Eli had warned her would cost something. A week ago, she had come out of this town dragged by the wrist with her dress torn at the shoulder. Now she rode in slow, with her face healed and her back straight, and the town did not know what to do with the sight of her. So it did what frightened towns do, which is gather at the edges of its own windows and watch and say nothing yet. A storekeeper stood in his doorway with a broom gone still in his hands. Two women at the dry goods porch leaned their heads together, and one of them touched the other's arm. A boy ran the length of the boardwalk to keep pace with the horses, eyes huge, until his mother caught the back of his shirt and hauled him in through a door. Eli read all of it, the way he read everything, without turning his head, his pale eyes moving under the low brim of the sweat-stained slouch hat. His face, the same drab, patient, stable hand's face it had been since the day he rode in. He had spent a week being nobody on purpose in this town, and he meant to spend a little while longer being nobody, because a man who shows his hand early gives the other side time to change the game. So he rode in slumped and easy, the faded indigo shirt buttoned to his throat and the grime worn into the creases of his hands. And not one soul on that street looked at him twice. They were all looking at the widow who had dared to come back. That suited him. Let them. They reined in before Doc Abernathy's, a narrow clappered house with a brass plate gone green by the door, and Eli stepped down first and stood a moment in the street with his back to the horses, his weight loose and even on both feet, taking the town's measure the way you take the measure of a room before you walk into it. The Marsh Saloon stood up the street to his right with its tall, ornate false front and its hanging sign creaking in the cold wind off the river. And there were 3 saddle horses at its rail this morning that had not been there a week ago. Good horses, deep-chested. The horses of men who rode for a living and not for a wage. He marked them and said nothing. He helped Della down, not touching her more than to steady her elbow, and the old doctor was already in his doorway with his small, round spectacles and his white beard, hurrying them in off the street the way a man hurries you in out of weather. Doc Abernathy got the door shut behind them and the bolt thrown, and then he stood with his back against it and looked at the two of them, and his watery blue eyes were frightened. "You shouldn't have come back," he said. "Della, child, you should not have come back here." She started to answer him, but the old man held up a thin hand, and there was real fear in it, the trembling kind. "It's worse than it was. It's a deal worse than it was. Marsh has done 2 things since you left, and either one of them by itself is enough to make me wish you'd stayed gone." He looked from her to Eli and back. "Sit, both of you. Let me tell it while the door's still locked." They sat at his deal table, and he stood over them, wringing his hands the way old men do who have spent a life unable to mend the worst of what they see. "First thing," he said, "he's put the homesteaders off the bend, all of them, not with a court paper this time, with men and guns. 3 days ago, Drace Hollis rode down there with 5 riders, and they ran the Tibbet family and the old freedman Solomon and the Pruitts off the water and posted it, and they fenced the spring, and they set a man on it with a rifle, and now there's not a poor family for 10 miles that can water a cow or fill a barrel without it comes through Marsh. He's done it. He's just done it. The way you'd think no man could just do a thing, and the law in this county is Marsh's law, so there's no man to do it to." Della had gone very still. "Where are they? The Tibbets? Solomon? Where'd they go?" "Camped along the dry wash below the church with what they could carry, and their stock dying for water and looking up this street every hour for somebody to do something." The old doctor's voice cracked. "And the second thing," He stopped. He took his spectacles off and polished them on his vest with hands that shook, and Eli watched him do it and knew, before the old man said it, that the second thing was the one that mattered. "Marsh sent down the wire for a man," Doc Abernathy said. "A professional. He came in on the stage 2 days ago, and he's been at the saloon since. And I've doctored in rough country 40 years, and I have never in my life been as afraid of a quiet man as I am of this one. His name is Clay Renner." The name meant nothing to Della. Eli's face did not change at all, which was its own kind of answer, and only a man who'd been watching very closely would have seen the small thing that happened behind his pale eyes, a kind of cold settling, like water going still before it freezes. "Renner," Eli said, flat, not a question. "You know him." The old man peered at him. "I know the kind." Eli stood up from the table and went to the front window and stood at the side of it, not in front of it, and looked up the street at the 3 good horses at the saloon rail. "Doc," he said, "the water's the thing. Families without water can't wait on courts, and they can't wait on me. You take Della out the back of here, and the 2 of you load every can and barrel you can find, and you get water down to those people in the wash. Today, this morning, and you make a show of it where the town can see, because a town that watches one decent thing done sometimes remembers it can do another." He turned from the window. "I'll see to Marsh." Della was on her feet. "You'll see to Marsh, alone, while I haul water." "Yes." "No." She came around the table to him. Her bruised face was set. The way he'd learned meant the end of arguing. "That's the very thing I told you back at the shack I wouldn't do. I'm not going to fetch and carry while you go up against 3 guns for me. We came back together, Eli. We stand together." He looked at her a long moment, and the patience in his face was the patience of a man who has had this exact disagreement before, with other people in other streets, and watched how it ended. "Della," he said, low, just for her, "there are 2 ways this comes out today. One way, I talk it down and nobody's hurt, and for that, I need you nowhere near Marsh, because the only card he's got worth playing is you. You understand me? The day I have to be afraid for where you're standing is the day a man like that has already won. The other way, it doesn't talk down. And if it comes to the other way, I cannot do what I'd have to do and keep one eye on you at the same time. So you'll let me keep my eyes free. You'll haul water with the doc in the open where there's people, and you'll let those families see your face doing it because they need to see somebody isn't running. Will you do that for me? Not because you're weak, because you're the one thing on this street I can't afford to lose." It cost her, but she did it. He saw her decided, the same flat decisive set of the jaw that had refused Marsh's offer in the dirt a week ago, and she nodded once and went to the back of the house with the old doctor, and within the quarter hour, the 2 of them were loading water cans onto the doctor's spring wagon in the alley behind the house, in plain view of half the town. And the sight of the widow Wren and old Doc Abernathy openly carrying water to the families Marsh had run off the bend went up and down the boardwalks like a small electric thing, and here and there a man who had stood and watched her dragged a week ago came down off his porch, shamefaced, and put his shoulder to a barrel. It was not much, but Eli had been right that a town remembers. He watched it begin from the side of the window, and then he settled the slouch hat lower and went out the front door and walked up the middle of the street toward the saloon. Slow, slumped, a tired hired man with grime in the creases of his hands, and he left the oilcloth bundle where it was, lashed behind his saddle at the doctor's rail because he had not yet decided he would need it, and a man who decides too early decides wrong. The inside of the Marsh Saloon was dim and warm and smelled of cigar smoke and spilled rye, and Eli stood inside the bat wings a moment, letting his eyes come down out of the white glare. And in that moment, he took the whole room the way he took every room, all at once, and without seeming to. Marsh sat at the big table at the back under the cracked back bar mirror, broad and florid in his fine charcoal coat, his gold watch chain looped across the brocade strain of his belly, the silver-headed cane hooked over the chair back, a half-smile already on his face because word had reached him the moment Eli left the doctor's. Drace Hollis stood at Marsh's right shoulder in his black duster, lank black hair to the jaw, the coiled bullwhip on his belt, and the tied-down Colt on his hip, and his cold, flat brown eyes fixed on Eli the second the bat wings moved. And at the end of the bar, not at Marsh's table, off by himself with one boot hooked on the rail and a glass of water, not whiskey, Eli marked that, stood a man Eli had never laid eyes on and knew inside of one breath for exactly what he was. Tall, rangy, gaunt, in a long slicker, the color of old bone, sandy hair going gray under a pale, high-crowned hat, and two pearl-gripped revolvers worn high and forward, where a working man's hands fall natural. He stood the way Eli stood. That was the thing. He had no tension in him at all, no readiness on display, and that lack of it was the most dangerous thing in the room, because a man who has to show you he's ready isn't, and a man who doesn't need to show you is the one you watch. Clay Renner turned his head and looked at Eli down the length of the bar with pale, gray-flecked eyes and a small, courteous smile, and he looked at him the way one craftsman looks at another's tools, idle, professional, faintly curious. And then, because Eli was slumped and grimed and drab in the faded indigo shirt with the manure on his boots, Renner's eyes went over him and moved on, the way a wolf's eyes go over a fence post, and the small smile stayed, but the interest left it. He had decided Eli was nothing. That was good. Eli let him. "Well," Marsh said from the back, expansive, pleased, the contemptuous half-smile spreading. "The stable hand. Cobb, is it? The one who fancies himself a knight." He gestured with one fat-ringed hand at the empty room, as if at an audience. "I'll be honest with you, Cobb. I didn't expect to see you again. I thought you'd had the sense to take the Wren woman somewhere and have your fun with her and move along, the way your kind does. But here you are, walked right back into my town and into my saloon, and I find I'm almost glad, because it saves me sending for you." He leaned back in the chair and laced his fingers over his belly. "You've cost me a week and some dignity, and a man in my position can't afford to lose either where the town can see. So let's settle it, you and I, plain. I want the deed to Wren's Bend. The widow's got it or you've got it, makes no difference to me. You bring it to me signed over, today, and I'll let you ride out of this country with your skin, and I'll even let the widow go with you. That's a generous offer from a man you've insulted twice. Take it." Eli stood inside the bat wings with his hat low and his hands loose at his sides and his shoulders rounded, and he said, in the flat, quiet voice of a tired working man, "There's families down in the wash with no water, Marsh. Children. You fenced the spring. I fenced my spring. It was never your spring. Everything in this country," Marsh said, and the half-smile went a degree colder, "is my spring. That's a thing you'd have learned, Cobb, if you were the kind of man who learned things, instead of the kind that gets himself killed over a woman and a hole full of water. Drace Hollis shifted his weight at Marcia's shoulder, and his hand had drifted down to rest easy on the coiled whip, and his cold eyes had not left Eli's face this whole while. There was something working behind them. Eli had felt it the first day in the street, and he felt it now, stronger. The enforcer staring at him a half-second too long, a man trying to place a face, a half-memory snagging and not coming free. Drace did not know what it was. Eli did, and Eli kept his own face the drab patient mask it had been, because the last thing he wanted was for the snag to come loose in this room with the families still without water and Della in the open street. "I'll make you the same offer I'll make once," Eli said, and he said it to Marsh, but he said it for the gaunt man at the bar to hear, because Renner was the only one in the room worth the saying. "Open the spring, let the families water their stock, tear up your eviction, and I'll take Della Wren out of your country, and you'll never see either one of us again. And your name stays whatever it is, and nobody gets hurt over a piece of ground." He let a bead of silence sit in the smoke. "That's the cheap way, Marsh. Take the cheap way. The other one costs more than you've got." Marsh laughed. It came up out of his thick chest, genuine, delighted, the laugh of a man who has never once in his life been made to pay the full price of anything. "Listen to him," he said, to Drace, to Renner, to the room. "Listen to the stable tramp talk about what things cost." He came forward in his chair and put one fat hand flat on the green baize, and the rings glinted. "Let me tell you what things cost, Cobb, since you're so fond of the word. I sent a wire 2 days ago and $1,000, and that bought me the gentleman at the bar, who has put more men in the ground than you've shod horses, and who is going to stand right there and watch while Drace teaches you the difference between a man who owns a country and a saddle bum who mucks stables in it. That's what things cost, and here's the part you'll want to hear." The half-smile was gone now. What was under it was uglier and older. "I don't have the widow, yet, but I know where she is. She's out there in the street this morning hauling water like a charwoman where the whole town can see her make a fool of me, and I have been very patient, Cobb, very patient, but my patience is a thing with a bottom to it, and you have found it. So, this is how it goes. You walk out of here and you bring me Della Wren and the signed deed, both within the hour. Or I send Drace and Mr. Renner out into that street to fetch the widow themselves, in front of God and the town, and I promise you it will not be gentle, and it will not be private, and the lesson of it will be seen by every soul in Coldwater Forks who ever thought of crossing me. Which is rather the point." He sat back. "An hour, Cobb, the deed and the woman. Now get out of my saloon." Eli stood very still inside the batwings. Out in the street, faint through the swinging doors, he could hear it. The creak of the doctor's spring wagon, the slosh of water in the cans, a child's thin voice, Della's voice answering it low and steady, the ordinary brave sounds of decent people doing a decent thing in the open. He had come back to this country to keep a debt of conscience, a thing he had told Della about over the fire, in words he would not say twice, and he had spent a week being nobody, so that he might never have to be the other thing again. He had built a quiet around himself, a stitch at a time, a stable and a woodlot at a time, year on year, and he had meant the quiet to last him to the grave. And he understood, standing in the smoke with Marsh's hour ticking, and the gaunt professional watching idle at the bar, and Drace's half-memory clawing at the edge of recognition, that the quiet was about to end, and that he was the only one in the room who knew it. He looked at Renner. Just once, plain, the length of the bar, and he gave the professional the only warning he was ever going to give, the courtesy of one tradesman to another, knowing it would not be taken. "You don't want this work," Eli said to him, quiet. "Whatever he paid you, it's not enough. You've got a good name for being smart. Be smart now. Get on your horse." Clay Renner turned his head and looked at the grimed, stable hand in the faded shirt, and the small, courteous smile widened just slightly, almost kind, the smile of a man being given advice by a fence post. "Friend," Renner said, soft, "I don't believe I caught your meaning, but I'll give you this. You've got more sand than most. It won't help you." He lifted his glass of water an inch in something like a toast and set it down. "Go fetch the man his deed, or don't. I'm paid either way." And that was the moment Eli let go of the last of the cheap way and felt it go. The way you feel a held breath go out of you, with something almost like relief and something a great deal like grief. He turned and pushed out through the bat wings into the white glare of the street. Behind him, he heard Marsh say something to Drace, low, and heard Drace laugh his thin laugh, and heard the scrape of chairs, and he knew the hour Marsh had given him was a lie, because men like Marsh give you an hour to make the trap close while you think you're walking free. He was right. He had not gone 20 feet up the boardwalk toward the doctors, toward Della, when it sprang. They had said it before he ever rode in. That was the thing he understood too late and would not forgive himself. The 3 good horses at the rail had not been Renner's alone. 2 riders he had not marked came out of the alley between the bank and the store ahead of him, mounted, fast. And they did not come at Eli at all. They came past him at a hard trot, cutting him off from the doctors, and they went straight for the spring wagon where Della stood lifting a water can down into the arms of the Tibbet woman, and they were on her before any man in that street could have crossed it. Eli came off the boardwalk into the dirt at a dead run, and even then, even running, the cold, flat part of his mind that never stopped working was counting. 2 mounted men on Della, Drace, and Renner now coming through the bat wings behind him, the town scattering off the boardwalks like quail, the open ground between him and her a clear 30 yards of nothing. And he knew he could not cover it in time. And the knowing of that was the worst single thing he had felt in 11 years. The nearer rider leaned down out of his saddle and got a fistful of Della's auburn hair and the borrowed sheepskin collar, and she fought him. She got a hand on the saddle horn and braced and would not be lifted clean. And the Tibbet woman screamed, and old Doc Abernathy flung himself at the horse's head with both thin arms, and was knocked spinning into the dust, and the rider hauled Della half off her feet and dragged her, stumbling, kicking, back up the middle of the street toward the saloon, toward Marsh, who had come out now onto the saloon steps to watch his lesson taught, the silver-headed cane in his hand and the contemptuous half-smile back on his florid face, exactly as it had been a week ago, exactly. The whole tableau reset and raised. The widow dragged through the dirt of the main street, the town frozen on the boardwalks, the boss above it all on his steps, and this time no whip but 2 guns and a hired killer. And this time the stakes the lives of a dozen poor families, and the woman Eli Cobb had quietly, over a run of cold, quiet days at a shack in the foothills, come to love. They got her to the open ground before the saloon, and the rider threw her down the way Drace had thrown her down before, and she landed hard on her knees in the rutted dirt, her hair torn loose to her shoulder, her hands flat in the street, and she did not cry out. She got her head up. That was Della, even down on her knees with 2 mounted guns over her, and Marsh leering down from the steps and the whole cowed town watching from the shadows of its porches. She got her chin up and her shoulders back, and she looked for Eli, found him, 20 paces off, stopped now, very still in the middle of the street, and she held his eyes and did not beg. Marsh came down 1 step from the saloon. "Drace," he said, easy, carrying, for the whole street to hear. "I believe the stable hand needs the lesson made plain after all. Take the whip to her till he hands over that deed, and if he won't, take it to her anyway, so the town learns what stubbornness costs in my country." And Drace Hollis came down off the saloon walk into the dirt, uncoiling the long black bullwhip as he came, his thin, cruel mouth stretched in a sneer, his cold eyes bright, and he shook the whip out to its full length in the dust behind him and drew his arm back, and over Della Wren on her knees, in the middle of the main street of Coldwater Forks. The whip rose up against the white sky, the same whip, the same arm, the moment before harm, and Marsh watched from his step, and Clay Renner leaned in the saloon doorway with his thumbs in his belt, idle and unworried, and the town held its breath behind its windows, and every single card was on Marsh's table, and every card said the drab-hired man was beaten, and the drab-hired man straightened up. It was not a sudden thing, and that was what made it terrible to the few who were close enough to see it. He did not lunge or shout. He simply came up out of the rounded-shouldered slouch of the tired working man, came up to his full height, 6 feet and an inch of him, and the slump went out of his back and the patience went off his face, and his hands stopped being a stable hand's hands and became something else, hanging loose and ready at his sides, and his pale gray eyes, those flat, calm, watchful eyes that never seemed to blink first, went cold the way the deep part of a river goes cold, all the way down, and looked up the street at Drace Hollis, and the raised whip, and the woman on her knees, and the man who had spent a week being nobody at last, for the first time, let himself be seen. Della saw it from the dirt, and something in her chest went still and certain. Marsh, on his step, did not see it, or saw it and did not understand it, and the half-smile stayed fixed and stupid on his face. Renner, in the doorway, came off his idle lean by 1 degree, his head tilting, the professional in him catching the change in the air a half-beat before his mind could name it, his pale eyes narrowing on the stable hand who had just stopped being a stable hand. But it was Drace Hollis, closest of all of them, the whip at the top of its arc, and his cold eyes flicking to the source of that sudden stillness in the street. It was Drace who looked full into the lifted face of the man coming up to his height in the white glare, with the cold dropping into his eyes. And Drace Hollis went rigid, the whip frozen at the height of its rise, and the blood drained out of his weather-burned face from the jaw upward until it was the gray of old ash, and his cruel mouth came open, and the half-memory that had clawed at him for a week in the doorway, and the street tore loose all at once and showed him, in the worst instant of his life, exactly whose face he was looking at across 30 feet of Coldwater Forks dirt. His arm with the whip in it began very slowly to come down, not to strike, but because the strength was going out of it. His other hand, the one with the puckered burn scar across its back, drifted toward the tied-down colt on his hip, and then stopped, shaking, because some animal part of him understood that to reach for it would be the last thing his hand ever did. "Marsh," Drace said. His voice came out cracked, a whisper that didn't carry, meant for his boss and reaching no further than his own dry throat. "Marsh. God, that ain't Marsh. That's—" And up the street, in the white morning light, the man they had all called a stable tramp let his right hand fall, easy and sure and unhurried, to the place at his hip, where, under the faded indigo shirt, the drab work clothes had been hiding something dark and oiled and old and waiting, and reached. The oilcloth fell away from Eli Cobb's hands like a shed skin, and the two ivory grips came up into the hard, low light of the Coldwater Forks afternoon, and for one held breath, the whole street seemed to forget how to move. Drace Hollis stood frozen with his whip arm still cocked back over Della's bowed head, his mouth half open on a word he had not yet found, and the color that had been draining out of his weathered face for the last 10 seconds finished draining all at once, leaving him gray as ash under the black brim of his hat. He had been trying to place that face since the man first stepped between him and the widow, weeks ago, trying and failing, the half-memory itching at him like a name on the tip of a tongue. And now, with the ivory in the light, and the stable hand standing to his full height, and the slouch hat tipped back off pale gray eyes, gone flat and cold as river ice. The memory came home to roost, and it brought terror with it. Eli did not shout, he did not lunge. He simply was no longer the bent, grimed, invisible man who had mucked their stalls and forked their hay and carried their water for a week and let them all look straight through him. He had straightened, and in straightening, he had become somebody else entirely. And every man on that street who had any sense at all felt the temperature of the day drop without knowing why. "Drace," Eli said, and his voice was quiet, almost gentle, the way you might speak to a horse that had spooked at its own shadow. "Put it down." The whip did not come down. Drace's arm shook, locked between the order he had been given and the dread climbing his spine, and somewhere off to the left, on the saloon steps, Augustus Marsh's heavy voice cracked out impatient and contemptuous as a man swatting a fly. "What in God's name are you waiting for? He's a saddle tramp with a borrowed pair of pistols. Cut her. Cut her now, and we'll deal with him after." But Drace did not cut her. Drace was looking at the notches on the smooth, worn grip of the gun nearest him, the faint hand-cut nicks in the old ivory, and he was remembering a yellowed handbill he had pulled out of a drawer 3 nights ago and held to a lamp, and he was remembering at last what name had been printed across the top of it in heavy black letters, and the name was loose in his throat now, and it would not stay down. Clay Renner moved before any of them. The hired killer had been standing easy this whole while, a little apart, his bone-colored slicker hanging still in the cold wind off the river, his thin mouth set in the patient, courteous half-smile of a man who had seen 100 frightened towns and 100 desperate husbands and 100 cornered men reach for guns they did not know how to use. He had been waiting, almost bored, for the stable hand to do something foolish, so that he could end it cleanly and collect Marsh's money and ride on to the next contract. But Renner was a professional, and a professional reads hands the way a parson reads scripture, and what Renner had just watched the stable hand's hands do, the speed of it, the economy, the way the oilcloth came off and the grips came up in one unbroken motion with not a wasted inch anywhere in it. That was not the hands of a husband or a homesteader or a saddle tramp. Renner's smile did not fall away so much as it set, hardening into something careful, and his own hands went very still at his sides. Deliberately still, the stillness of a man who has just realized he is standing far too close to the edge of something and does not want to make any sudden move that might tip him over it. Della Wren knelt in the cold street dirt where Drace had forced her down, one arm half raised over the purpling bruise on her cheek, her auburn hair fallen loose across her face, and through the strands she looked up, not at the whip above her, but at Eli, and she was not afraid of him. That was the thing the whole town would talk about afterward in the years to come, the ones who had been there, that the widow Wren, with a killer's whip raised over her skull, had turned her face up toward the most dangerous man any of them had ever stood near, and there had been no fear in her at all, only a fierce and steady trust, because she alone in that street already knew exactly who he was and had known for days, and she had chosen him anyway, name and paper and all. Eli, she said, and just his name, just the one he had given her, the small, plain, borrowed one. He heard it. The smallest thing moved at the corner of his mouth. "I've got it, Della," he said, not looking away from Drace. "Don't you move." And then, to the whole frozen street, to the cowed crowd packed 3 deep along the boardwalks who had watched this woman dragged and beaten twice now and done nothing, to Marsh on his steps and Renner in his slicker and Drace shaking with his arm in the air. To all of them at once he raised his voice just slightly, just enough to carry, and what he said was the truth he had carried buried for 2 years under stable grime and other men's hay. "Last chance," Eli said. "Put down the whip, let her stand up, and ride out of this territory tonight, every one of you, and you'll live to be old men. I'd rather that. I came here tired of all this. But if that whip comes down on her, I will give you the other thing, and you have all heard which other thing it is, even if you haven't placed my face." Marsh laughed, a fat, ugly, disbelieving bark of a laugh, and lifted his silver-headed cane and pointed it down the steps. "Listen to him. Listen to the stable boy make speeches. Drace, I'm not going to tell you again. His name is the Carver." Drace said it. The words came out of him cracked and low and shaking, but in the dead silence of that street they carried to every soul on it, and the effect was like a cold wind passing over a wheat field, a visible ripple of recognition going through the crowd, heads turning, an old freighter near the livery taking one stumbling step backward, a gray-bearded miner crossing himself, a woman pressing her hand to her mouth. The older men in that town knew the name. They had grown up on it. They had heard it whispered in trail camps and bunkhouses and the back rooms of saloons 20 years gone. The name of the shootist out of the southern territories that other shootists would not face. The one there was paper on in 3 territories and a price that had only ever climbed. The one the stories said had killed more men than the fever, and then one day vanished off the face of the earth so completely that half the men telling the stories had decided he must be long dead. And here he stood, in a faded indigo work shirt buttoned to the throat and a manure-stained vest and cracked stovepipe boots, with 3 days of dark stubble on his lean jaw and early gray at his temples, in the middle of their nothing little cattle town, with the ivory in his hands and the cold in his eyes. Alive. "The Carver," Marsh repeated, and for the first time since Della had known of him, since the day his men ran her hands off and blocked her credit and finally sent Drace down the street with his whip, the contemptuous half-smile slipped off the town boss's florid face. His small, pale eyes went from the stable hand to his own gunman's gray terror, to the hired killer he had paid a fortune to bring in, and he found no comfort in any of the three. "That's a child's tale," Marsh tried, but the bluster had gone watery. "That man died at Sweetwater years back. Everyone knows it." "Everyone was wrong," Eli said. The whip came down. Maybe Drace meant to do it. Maybe his cramping arm simply gave, the muscles locked too long and finally failing, the lash sagging and dropping of its own weight toward the kneeling woman below. It did not matter which, because Eli had been watching that arm for the whole of the conversation, the way he had watched it weeks ago in this same street. And he had already decided what he would do the instant it moved, and so when it moved, he was not reacting. He was simply arriving where he had long since planned to be. What the town saw, what they swore to later, around their stoves, and in their letters, and in the version of the story that outlived all of them, was almost nothing at all. A blur. A flicker of motion, too fast to break into parts. One ivory-handled Colt seemed to be in Eli's hand and pointed at the ground, and then, between one heartbeat and the next, with no traveling in between that any eye could follow, it was up and level, and the report of it cracked flat across the false fronts and rolled away into the foothills, and Drace Hollis's bullwhip was gone. Not the man, the whip, struck from his grip and flung spinning into the dust 10 feet away with the handle splintered, the lash lying limp and harmless as a dead snake in the rutted street. Drace stood there with his empty stinging hand open in front of his face, staring at it, alive, unhurt, but for the sting, the whip that had ruled this street through fear lying broken and beyond his reach. He had not even seen the man draw. Nobody had. Renner had, or had seen enough of it, and Renner had not moved a muscle, and that told the whole street more than any speech could have. The deadliest other man any of them knew had watched the Carver draw, and had kept his own pearl grips holstered, and his own hands wide and empty and visible, because Clay Renner, alone among the cruel, understood precisely what he had just seen, and wanted no part of finding out the rest. "Renner!" Eli's second gun had cleared leather now too, the pair of them up and easy and certain, one trained loosely toward the saloon steps, and one toward the man in the bone-colored slicker, and the cold, pale eyes settled on the professional with something almost like courtesy in them, one craftsman to another. "You've got no quarrel with me, and I've got none with you. Marsh hired your gun against a name he didn't know. You know it now. Walk to your horse." For a long moment, Clay Renner did not answer. His gray-flecked eyes traveled the length of Eli Cobb, taking the true measure of him at last, the still economy of him, the way the two muzzles never wavered a hair, the way the man's breathing had not changed at all, and the professional did the arithmetic he had built a hard career on doing fast and doing right, and the arithmetic came out the only way it could. He let out a slow breath through his nose. The careful set went out of his shoulders, and the courteous half-smile came back, but it was a different smile now, rueful, a smile that conceded the whole board. "Mr. Marsh," Renner said, without turning his head, his soft voice carrying easy in the silence, "you neglected to tell me who I'd be working against. A man likes to know that before he takes the money." He lifted 2 long fingers slowly, deliberately, to the brim of his pale, high-crowned hat, and tipped it a 1/4 inch toward Eli, the salute of one expert to a better one. "I don't draw against the Carver for any man's water rights," he said. "I'm a professional, not a fool, and the difference is I'm going to be alive next week." And then, with great care, and his hands always in plain sight, Clay Renner backed 3 steps to the hitching rail, gathered his reins, swung up onto his tall gray horse, and walked it at an unhurried amble down the length of the main street and out past the weathered sign that read, Coldwater Forks, Wyoming Tear. And he did not look back, and the territory never saw him again. That left Marsh. The town boss stood alone now on the saloon steps with the silver-headed cane gone slack in his fat hand, his enforcer disarmed and shaking, his hired killer riding away down the street, his whole machinery of fear taken apart in front of the entire town in the space of a single minute by a man he had dismissed as beneath his notice. He had owned this place. He had owned the bank and the store and the debt and the sheriff who was nowhere to be seen. And he had owned the people's silence most of all. And now he stood on his own steps and felt the silence change its texture, felt it stop being his. Eli holstered the gun pointed at Renner's empty road, slow, and kept the other loose at his side. And he crossed the street toward Della, not in any hurry, and he bent and put his free hand under her arm and lifted her up out of the dirt as gently as if she were made of something that could break. And she came up onto her feet and stood beside him, and she did not lean on him. She stood with her bruised chin lifted and her loose hair blowing in the cold wind, and she looked at Marsh across the street the way a person looks at something they have stopped being afraid of. "You sent Drace to take my deed by force," she said, and her voice was not loud, but it was steady, and it reached him. "You ran off my hands. You blocked my credit. You cut a dozen poor families off the only water for 30 miles. And you posted my home for eviction like I was a stranger to it. And before any of that," her voice caught just once and then held. "Before any of that, 3 months ago, my Tom went out to ride his fence line, and they brought him back to me dead under his horse at the bottom of a draw. And you stood in my parlor with your hat in your hands and called it an accident, and you have wanted his water from the day it was filed." Marsh's broken-veined cheeks worked. "You can't prove a word of—" "He can." Eli's voice cut across it flat. He nodded once toward Drace, who still stood in the street staring at his empty hand, and Drace flinched as though he had been struck. "Your foreman's been carrying it, haven't you, Drace? A man like Marsh always keeps a man like you to do the things he won't soil his own hands on, and a man like you always knows where the bodies are because you're the one who put them there. You've got 2 ways to leave this street. You can leave it as the man who whipped a widow for a boss who's about to hang and who'll let you swing first to save his own fat neck. Or you can leave it as the man who finally told the truth about Tom Wren. I'd think hard. The Carver doesn't kill cowards in cold blood, Drace, but the law's coming, and the law hangs them." And it was the last word that broke Drace Hollis, not the gun. The gun had only disarmed him. It was the name and the certainty and the cold mercy of the offer, and the look on the faces of the townspeople he had bullied for years now turned on him without one shred of fear left in them. And Drace Hollis, hatchet-faced enforcer, foreman of cruelty, sank down to sit in the dust of the street he had ruled and put his burned hand over his eyes and told it. He told it all, there in the open, in front of the whole town, and old Doc Abernathy, who had come pushing through the crowd with his black bag. And the words came out of him in a flat, exhausted gush like water through a broken dam. How Marsh had wanted the Ben's water for the railroad spur from the first season. How Tom Wren had laughed him out of the saloon when he offered to buy it cheap. How Marsh had given the order with his own mouth in the back room over brandy that the Wren matter be made to look like an accident, and how Drace and another man, since drifted on, had ridden out and done it on a cold morning at the bottom of a draw where no one would see, and how Marsh had paid him in gold double eagles and gone the next day to stand in the widow's parlor with his hat in his hands. The town listened in a silence so total you could hear the wind worrying the saloon sign. And Augustus Marsh, hearing his own ruin spoken aloud in his own street by his own man, did the thing that men like him do when the fear they have built their kingdom on finally turns and faces them. He reached, clumsy and panicked, for the small pocket pistol in his fine charcoal coat, the little hideout gun a man like him carries and has never once had the nerve to use, and he got it half out, and Eli Cobb did not even raise the Colt still loose in his hand. He simply looked at him. He looked at Augustus Marsh down the cold, flat length of those pale gray eyes, and he said in that same quiet, unhurried voice he might have used on a spooked horse, "I wouldn't. I have spent 2 years trying not to be the man you're hoping I am. Don't make me today in front of her. Take your hand off it." And Marsh, looking into those eyes and seeing in them, finally and fully, exactly what he had failed to see all the weeks the man swept his stable, what every other soul in 3 territories had learned to see and fear, took his fat trembling hand off the little gun and let it drop back into his pocket, and the silver-headed cane clattered down the saloon steps, and Augustus Marsh began, helplessly, to weep. He was still weeping when the deputy from the county seat arrived 2 days later with a circuit marshal and a writ, brought by a rider Doc Abernathy had sent the moment Drace started talking, brought by a town that had at last found its nerve. Half of Coldwater Forks gave statements. The store clerk, who had been ordered to cut off the widow's credit, the bank teller who had the foreclosure papers Marsh had forged a deadline onto, the 2 homesteaders Marsh's men had run off the water at gunpoint, the widow with her children, and the old freedman who had filed alongside Tom Wren years before and could swear to the original claim, and Drace Hollis, who had nothing left to lose and some last starved scrap of a soul that wanted, before the end, to set one true thing down. Drace told it again to the marshal, all of it, the order and the draw and the gold, and signed his name to it. They took Augustus Marsh away in irons in the bed of a freight wagon. The man who had owned the town riding out of it, past the Coldwater Fork sign, with his fine coat dusty and his wrists chained, and the people he had cowed for years lined the boardwalk to watch him go. Not gloating, mostly just quiet, the way people are quiet when a long sickness finally breaks. He would stand trial at the county seat for the murder of Tom Wren, and the evidence and the witnesses and his own foreman's confession would be more than enough. And what the law did with him after was the law's to do, and Eli Cobb wanted no part of being the one to do it. That was the whole of the difference between them, and the town came to understand it in the days that followed, that the most feared gunman in 3 territories had stood with 2 pistols and a clean reason and the whole street's blessing to kill every cruel man on it, and had instead disarmed a whip, talked down a killer, broken an enforcer with the truth, and handed the boss to the marshal alive. He did not execute his enemies. He had killed enough men in his years to know the weight of it, and to want never to add to that weight again, unless there was no door left but that one, and Marsh, in the end, had left him a door. The mercy was the man. The mercy had always been the man, hiding under the grime, choosing every single morning for 2 years not to be the other thing. And the town had it backward, the way towns do, when they had thought him meek. He had never been meek. A meek man could not have done what he did in that minute on the street. He had been something far rarer and far harder. A dangerous man holding himself still, by an act of will renewed each day, the way you hold a drawn bow, until the morning came when letting go was the only kindness left. With Marsh gone to the law, the rest of it came undone the way a hard knot comes undone once you find the one strand that holds it. The eviction notice was void, forged, and worthless. The deed to Wren's Bend, the folded water-stained paper Tom had filed and died for, stood clean and clear in Della Wren's own name, witnessed now by half the county and defended by a marshal's own hand, and no one in that territory would ever again be fool enough to reach for it. The headgate Marsh's men had thrown across the creek was torn out, and the cold, sweet water ran free down the bend again to the dozen poor homesteads that had been dying of thirst on its edge. The widow with her children, the old freedman, the sick family in the far draw. And they came up the wagon road to the bend in the gold autumn light to thank her, and Della stood in her own dooryard and would not take their thanks, only took their hands, because she said it was Tom's water and Tom's land, and she was only keeping it the way he would have. Doc Abernathy doctored the last of the bruise off her cheek and pronounced her mended, and went home shaking his head and smiling, for he had half known something about the quiet, stable hand for weeks, had caught the wrongness of those gunmen's hands the first time he splinted the widow's face, and had said nothing, being a decent man who understood that some men carry their names like a sentence and deserve the chance to set the burden down. And so it came down, at the last, to the two of them, in the cabin, 2 hours out in the fold of the foothills where she had healed, with the reckoning over and the town quiet and the whole hard machinery of cruelty taken to pieces. And the only question left in the world was the one neither of them had said out loud. Eli stood by the corral in the cold blue dusk with the oilcloth in his hands again, and the 2 ivory-handled Colts wrapped inside it. And Della came out to him with the borrowed sheepskin coat about her shoulders, and her hair braided, and her color back, and the wedding band loose on her work-reddened hand. And she stopped a few feet off and looked at him wrapping the guns away. "You're thinking of riding on," she said. It was not quite a question. "There's paper on me in 3 territories, Della. The marshal that took Marsh, he heard the name same as everybody. He didn't move on me today because of what I did today. But a man like me is a thing other men come looking for sooner or later. Bounty men, old enemies, young fools wanting to be the one who took the Carver." He looked down at the wrapped bundle. "I came here to set one debt right. I knew your Tom, years back, before either of you. He did me a kindness once when I had no claim on one. And when the word came down the wire that a wren was in trouble in a Wyoming cow town, I couldn't ride past it. I told myself I'd see it set right, and then take myself somewhere far off where I couldn't bring this down on anybody. On you." Della crossed the last few feet of cold ground between them. She reached up and put her hand flat against his lean, stubbled jaw, and turned his face from the bundle to her, and her hazel-green eyes were steady and unafraid and full, and her split lip had healed to a small, pale line, and when she spoke, her voice did not shake at all. "I buried one good man in this ground," she said. "I'm not going to spend the rest of my life watching the road for the day they bring you to me dead at the bottom of a draw, too. So you'll do the other thing instead. You'll stay. You'll hang those guns up over my door, same as Tom's rifle hangs over it now. And if some young fool ever does come up that wagon road looking for a dead legend, he'll find a farmer at his own water with a wife who shoots passably, and a county that owes him everything, and a marshal 3 hours off who will come at a hard gallop. I know what you are, Eli. I've known since the night you told it to me by that fire. I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not ashamed of you, and I am not letting you go off to be a hunted ghost again on my account, when there's a whole life sitting right here at the bend, waiting for the both of us to live it. Stay. For a long moment, the most feared gunman in 3 territories did not say anything at all. He stood in the blue dusk, with her small, warm hand against his face, and her words settling into him like the first quiet snow. And something in the still, flat set of his eyes eased, some long-held tension, 2 years and 1,000 miles old, finally letting go, and he let out a breath he might have been holding since Sweetwater. He put his scarred, sure hand over hers where it lay against his jaw. "All right," Eli Cobb said. "All right, Della, I'll stay." So that was the way of it, and the way it stayed. The Carver, the name on the yellowed handbill, the legend the older men of 3 territories told their grandchildren and were not believed, was never again seen anywhere in the West, because there was no longer any such man to see. There was only a quiet, weathered farmer named Eli at the water's edge of a place called Wren's Bend, who married the widow who held the deed in a small clapboard church at the far end of Coldwater Forks Main Street, with half the county crowded in to witness it, and the old freedman standing up beside him, and who mended the head gate every spring, and ran a few head of cattle and a good kitchen garden, and let the homesteads downstream drink their fill of the cold, sweet water that a decent man had died for and a dangerous one had made safe. The 2 ivory-handled Colts in their tooled and ancient belt hung wrapped in their oilcloth on 2 pegs over the cabin door, above the lintel, beside Tom Wren's old rifle, and the dust gathered on the bundle season by season, and the notches in the worn ivory grew no deeper, and that was the dearest sight in all that country to the 2 people who lived beneath it, because of everything it meant by hanging there and staying still. On an evening late in that first autumn, with the trial done and Marsh gone where the law had sent him, and the whole long reckoning faded into a thing the town only told over winter fires, Eli walked down from the cabin through the cottonwoods to the creek, where it bent and pooled and ran on toward the thirsty homesteads below, and Della walked beside him with her hand light in the crook of his arm. The foothills had gone gold and then rose with the low sun. The cold water moved over its stones with a sound like quiet talking. Smoke from their own chimney climbed straight up into the still air behind them, and the first of the season's snow lay thin and untrodden on the high peaks beyond. And the cottonwood leaves came down 1 and 2 at a time onto the moving water, and were carried off downstream into the gathering blue. Eli Cobb stood at the edge of the water he had come so far to keep, with the woman who had chosen him whole, name and paper and all, warm against his side, and the most feared man in 3 territories looked out at the gold light going long across the foothills, and the leaves turning on the current, and the smoke standing up from the home he had earned. And he found, at last, after all the years and all the miles and all the men, that there was nothing left in him that wanted to be anywhere else, nor anyone else in all the wide, cold West, than exactly here, and exactly this: a farmer at the water's edge, at dusk, with her, and the guns at rest over the door, and the long day finally, quietly, done.